Hey folks, today I will be pulling out my old Craftsman Lathe and showing you how I turned these walnut and oak hardwood cups on another episode of Second Son Woodworks. Hope you'll stick around. I was lucky enough to find this Craftsman Lathe from a older gentleman in Helena, Montana. He was selling it on Craigslist at the time. I think this was back in 2016, and I found it and I've had it since, and it is a good tool. When I purchased it from this guy, he included all of the various fittings besides a chuck that I needed to learn how to turn. And I had never done any wood turning before that time when I bought this wood lathe, and I've just been learning when I have time, spare time, ever since. I always say that wood turning on a lathe is a whole lot like throwing a piece of clay on a pottery ceramics wheel. If you've ever done anything like that, I did a lot of that when I was in high school and in college, and I can definitely say that turning wood on a lathe is a whole lot similar, partly because the very first step in turning anything on your lathe is centering it and making sure that it is round, and you have to take off the corners. There's some ways that you can make this a little bit easier, such as cutting off the corners with a bandsaw. But I didn't do that with this because, well, the tools will work just fine if you get the speed up correctly and have it centered in between your headstock and your tailstock. Now, I am certainly no professional wood turner. I am learning, and I've been doing my best to learn from a variety of sources. First being the manual that is for this Craftsman lathe. I found a manual on the internet, and I actually have a hard copy as well. But referencing this is super helpful, as it actually does have some tips on wood turning itself. But in addition to that, I also have been using videos on YouTube and various articles that I have found on the internet. I actually never intended to use these blocks of wood that I glued up for wooden cups. I originally glued these pieces of oak and walnut together to turn ornaments, tree ornaments, for Christmas several years ago, and I did quite a few of those, but still had a number of the pieces left over. And so when I broke out the lathe this year to start doing some wood turning again, I decided, hey, I'll maybe try making one of these into a cup. And the first one I did, I didn't actually have on camera, and it ended up breaking because it was the first time that I was using a chuck, which you'll see here later on is how I bore out the center of the cups. Once you have the piece centered in between the tailstock and the headstock, you are then able to shape the outside of the cup, which is a really fun process. You can kind of be creative about the lines and the shape and the footing, etc. And I really like that part. Several months ago, I went ahead and decided to invest in a good chuck for my lathe so that I could start turning bowls and cups and actually boring out the center of things. And so I invested in this Nova chuck. I'll put a link in the description below. But it has been so fun. This thing is capable of doing a lot of different things, and it makes boring out the center area of pieces like this cup really easy. If you stick around till later on in the video, you'll watch me turn another cup using different lathe turning tools. I also recently invested in these carbide turning tools. I'll put a link in the description below for these ones. But the other tools that I use later on in the video which was actually filmed before this was filmed, which is a bit confusing. But the turning tools that I use for that cup were included with the lathe from the older gentleman that I bought it from back in 2016. But they are very dull, and I've done my best to sharpen them with the grinder that I have and the stones, etc. But sharpening turning tools is really difficult because they have certain curves on the tools. So I went ahead and got these carbide tip tools, and I gotta say that was probably one of the best purchases that I've ever made when it comes to tools for woodworking, just because it has made the process so much easier. These carbide tip tools have such sharper blades to them, especially compared to my old turning tools that I've been using for the last several years since I got this wood turning lathe. But these Savannah ones are really nice, and you can rotate the carbide tips when the blade or the edge goes dull, and gotta say, I like them. After getting all the dust off of the cup, I did the first coat of pure raw linseed oil, something that's food safe, on the cup, but I ended up doing quite a few additional coats off camera to do my best to seal up the cup before actually using it. Not exactly sure how often I will be using this cup, just because it is wood, but I'm going to give it a try and experiment with different types of liquids. Just like other things that I finish with this type of oil, it's best to sand in between each coat, and after sanding in between each coat, using an air compressor to blow off as much of the dust as possible to open up the grain, so that you can get that oil deeper and into more of the grain of the wood. If you're new to wood turning like I am, I'm glad that you have checked out this video. I'm just going to be sharing as many tips as I can with you to make your experience turning better and more fun and easier. And I just want to bring up your overall excitement for wood turning, because it's a really, really fun thing. Thanks for stopping by Second Son Woodworks. Hope you will continue to stick around. If you're liking what you see, hit the subscribe button below, and check out my other videos. This lathe actually sat up in storage in a garage in Montana for a year or so, and then I finally drove it down to California in a trailer. It's a pretty heavy, big cast iron lathe, but then it sat for a bit here too. I just didn't get time to pull it out, but when I finally did pull it out, I started turning with these old Craftsman turning tools that, like I mentioned earlier on in the video, are pretty dull, and you'll notice how much more difficult it was to bore out the center of this cup, which I actually did before the cup that you saw me turn earlier on in the video. But I still wanted to show this video so that you can see the difference between using old tools that aren't actually even full size, and they're not carbide, and they've just been kind of sharpened by myself, which, like I said, I have a grinder, but I don't have a grinder that's got the correct setup to really give a good sharpening to these tools. But they definitely don't work as good as the newer full-size tools, carbide tools, that I used for the other cup you saw me turn at the beginning of the video. Nevertheless, these tools lasted me and were useful for since I picked up this lathe in 2016, so for 5 years. Mind you, I haven't been doing a ton of turning, but I have turned quite a few legs and spindles, that kind of thing. But I really saw the difference when I was boring out the center of these cups when they are mounted with the chuck, pushing these tools in to try to bore out the center was pretty difficult, and you'll see that here in a second. It took me a while to figure out which chuck to purchase off of the internet. I needed to figure out the size of my machine to make sure that the chuck that I purchased would fit. And I just had to figure out how chuck works, the size that I needed, etc. I'll put a link in the description below for this Nova chuck that you'll see me attach here in a second. That has turned out to be a really good tool addition to my lathe setup. And I would definitely recommend giving it a try if you have a lathe and if you haven't done any sort of bowl turning where you don't have the tailstock pushed up against the piece that you're turning. The nice thing about this chuck from Nova is that it comes in a plastic case that holds all of the different pieces. There's quite a few different pieces that come with the chuck itself, and little small hardware. So having the case hold it all together is really handy, and it attaches pretty easy to my chuck, or to my lathe. The chuck attaches to the lathe pretty well. One thing that I will recommend is turning up the speed if you're using a chuck like this. When it's lower speed, it tends to shake a little bit more. That's just something I noticed. This chuck comes with a few different ways to mount a bowl or a cup. The way that I'm doing it for these cups is that it actually just squeezes onto the footing of the cup, but it comes with one that doesn't actually squeeze. It moves outward and attaches to and pushes up against the bottom side of a foot, but an inverted foot. Which I do for another project that I'll be releasing a video for here soon, so stick around and you'll see how that works too. This lathe actually has the ability to rotate the headstock so that you can do outboard facing turning, but I don't have anything to rest my tool on to do this. I was thinking about using some sort of rolling miter saw extension stand that you usually put on the other side of a table saw when you're pushing something through, and it rolls the material and supports it. But I was thinking that that could possibly work as a tool rest for doing outboard turning with this lathe. But if you have any ideas, you should throw them up in the comment section below. I had a bit of difficulty getting enough light into the right area where I was doing the turning. I had been closing my garage door in my workshop because of the noise to try to cut it down in my neighborhood. Don't want to bother my neighbors too much, but as a result, closing the door makes it a bit darker, especially when I started boring out the center of these cups. I have this little lamp that's next to the lathe, and I was able to move that around a bit, but still wasn't perfect. Eventually maybe I'll find some sort of light that can go right over top of the lathe. If you got any ideas, also put those in the comment section. It's also super important to make sure that you have your lathe attached to your work surface or your workbench, whatever you're having the lathe rest on. You need to make sure that it's completely attached to that surface. I used 4 carriage bolts on my lathe to attach it to my miter saw station / work storage bench in the garage, because the lathe will vibrate a ton. And I tried to just do it with 2 carriage bolts at first when I first pulled out the lathe, and it wasn't enough. I needed to do all 4 and make sure that they were tightened up well with nuts in order to keep the lathe from vibrating, because you're putting so much pressure on the lathe itself when you push your knives up against the workpiece when it's spinning at 1,000 RPMs, and so make sure you attach it to your workbench. Doing lathe turning work like this is extremely messy. The sawdust gets all over the place, and when I first pulled it out, and ever since I've had this lathe, I've just used goggles and some sort of mask over my mouth. But I ended up recently buying a full face shield that's completely clear, and I've been really loving this face shield. It can move up and down, and it tightens around your head, and it's kind of funny, since I started using that, I still squint my eyes because I still feel like the dust is going to be hitting me in the face, or the little bits of wood, but I don't have to worry about that, so I need to stop squinting my eyes. Now, coming from somebody who is quite new to wood turning, be very safe when you're using these tools, and make sure that things are all tightened up well before you start spinning things really fast and trying to cut them with a knife. It's super dangerous. You can get really hurt, and make sure you do wear the correct safety equipment for your eyes and your mouth, and even your ears, because of the amount of noise that is made from this process. And like I said, make sure that things are well tightened up. Like, for instance, the chuck around the foot of the cup, make sure that that's extremely tight. I think I had this cup fly off once or twice on me, and that's kind of scary. You don't want that thing to hit you, and or you don't want to break the piece that you're working so hard on. So be safe and take your time. This is the last cup that I have recently turned on the lathe, and this one I was able to do with the newer turning tools, and with the Nova chuck like the other ones. But unfortunately, you'll see here in a bit that I ended up boring too much out of the center of the cup, and I thinned the sidewall so much that a hole appeared. But I still wanted to go ahead and show the footage of me turning this cup so that you could see the process one more time, but from a different angle, for how I set up the lathe to begin, the centering of the wood, and taking off the rough wood stock from the actual walnut and oak. So keep watching. I think if I was to do more of these cups and to try to speed up the process, I would get an attachment for the tailstock of the lathe to be able to actually drill the center out of a cup, or at least the majority, the first part, with some sort of big drill Forstner type bit that I would just push into the cup, like I'm doing with this lathe turning tool, but instead with the tailstock moving in. If you have any tips on that process, I would greatly appreciate you throwing those up in the comment section. Well, folks, that's it for another episode of Second Son Woodworks. Hope that you have enjoyed watching me do some turning on my old Craftsman Lathe. I hope it gets you excited about getting in the shop and maybe doing some turning yourself. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. If you haven't already, you should hit the subscribe button. That would really help me out and the channel out. You can follow me on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. And like I always say, get in the shop, build something cool. Take care.